Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about the career aspects of transferring law schools. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about the career aspects of transferring law schools. Welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Well, it's kind of that time of year when students are starting to think maybe about transferring, particularly if they did really well first semester. And one of the big considerations is always around this job question. You know, the big question is always, is this really going to help me get a better job for my 2L summer and later on in my career? What do you think about this in general?
I think generally it will. If you're thinking about transferring, I assume you're thinking about making a pretty big step up in terms of the school you're going to be transferring to. And I think that actually can make a pretty big difference, definitely in your summer search. And, you know, that's going to lead to full-time employment and down the road. So I think it can actually have a pretty big impact.
Yeah, this is the unfortunate part of the legal profession. It tends to be very, very hierarchical. So I agree with you. I think generally, you know, if you're upgrading to like, you know, as you said, a much more sort of national prestigious type of school, I think it's almost always going to help your job prospects. And not just around that first job, but even later. You know, I always found it amazing how much people cared about where a possible lateral who was going to switch to a different firm had gone to school. It was like, who even cares at this point? But people did care.
Definitely. And I think, you know, the alumni, you know, there's other parts of it, but just reputation alone and sort of ranking, which, you know, may be silly, but just is the way it is.
Exactly. You deal with it. All right. Well, for our listeners who maybe are not really familiar with this yet, let's talk kind of about the basics of the OCI process. We do have some podcasts on this, but let's just cover the basics and how that might work for people who do end up transferring to a new school, because that can get a little bit complicated.
It can, and it can be a little chaotic and, you know, sort of a tight fit with the transfer process. So generally with OCI, you are going to bid on the employers that you want to interview with, and then depending on the school, employers may get a choice of students. The higher ranked schools, they don't get a choice of students. It's all just a random lottery. So it's sort of where you rank, you know, the employers and how it fits into the slot. And then you know, get your interviews and you sort of do it all during a week or two, generally at a hotel. And you are sort of going through this speed dating process of interviewing with, you know, a lot of employers in a short amount of time. And that's really how, you know, many students find their 2L jobs. The issue for transfer students is that the transfer process is sort of happening at the same time that the bidding process is happening, you know, probably like late spring. And you're probably finding out, making a decision about transferring, you know, as you're leading into almost OCI. So you're kind of making like this quick leap to, okay, now I go to the school and I'm going to interview, you know, for places at this school.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The complicating factor is that these kind of overlap. So I definitely knew of people who had signed up for OCI at their original school and were fully planning on going through that process. And then they got word that they were able to transfer. And within a matter of days, suddenly we're bidding on firms at OCI at this new school. And yeah, it was just, I mean, it worked out well for most people, but it was definitely kind of a chaotic process.
Yeah, and so I think you need to be prepared for that going into it. But generally, doing OCI at the school you're transferring to, which most likely is a much higher ranked school, is going to be better for you, give you more opportunity. Some people may be transferring to a school that doesn't really have much OCI, so they may not even be as familiar with the process. So it's a good idea to sort of educate yourself on what's going to be involved so you can jump in and be ready.
Right. I talked to people definitely who said, firms that would not have looked at me a week ago at my old school are now welcoming me into these interviews with open arms. This is kind of crazy. I had no idea. Yeah. So I think you just want to be aware of the process, understand what the deadlines are, how that's going to work, basic logistics around like bidding, where might you want to be bidding, that kind of thing. It might have already happened. So, you need to figure out like how you're going to slot into that. But the reality is, these top schools that do take a lot of transfer students, they have a process.
They definitely do. And, as we've recommended in the past, just for OCI, if you don't get a slot with the place you want, there's always a chance to write into them directly, even show up on the interview day and get in. Generally, that, reflects well on you, that you care enough to make the effort. And I would say that if you're writing in, you should definitely explain that you were a transfer, you're late to the process. That's fine. Everyone understands that.
Yeah, I think it's mostly a question of like, you need to figure out where you're going to need to be, what you're going to need to be doing, how much lead time do you have on all this. You kind of need to be, if you are going to think about transferring, you need to be ready to jump in if it happens for you. Because this will happen all before classes actually start.
And something that I think comes up that not everyone understands is you are only going to have your transcript from the school that you were transferring from. And firms know that. There's no issue there. It's not like they expect you to have grades from the other school or are going to be confused or not know what it means. Also, if you've transferred to the new school, they're going to assume that you've done well enough to transfer, and that's fine.
Right. My impression is firms actually love transfer students because it showed that you did really well and also that you have ambition.
Definitely. I mean, it is a process to transfer, and it takes a lot of effort on your part. So I think it is, a positive. And I think firms, they know that you are going to start at this new school and you did that well at the other school. I think they sort of assume you're going to, be able to hold your own at the new school.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, what if, say, a firm or an organization was interviewing at the first school, but they're not at the new school? So I'm thinking maybe, more local options. Say you were in a more local market that you think you want to return to. I mean, I assume someone can still reach out to them, right? And just explain the situation.
Definitely. You definitely can. You should let them know that you're transferring to the new school, but you still want to interview with them. You're still interested. I'm sure they're going to be thrilled that you want to see them, that you did well enough at your first school. And I also think there are situations where transfers either go through OCI at the first school or at least start the process. So I think, you're not really, it's not like necessarily clear that you are supposed to do it one way or the other. So I think it's fine as long as you're honest about, that you're leaving and where you are, and just make it clear to them. I would imagine they would be interested in talking to you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see why you would turn down like the top student at your local school who's decided to transfer to Harvard. I mean, they're going to be like, great, you still are considering us? Awesome.
Exactly. So I think you just need to be proactive.
Right, exactly. And kind of figure out what you want and ask for it. Well, do you think it matters later on that much in a legal career? Say if you're lateraling, if someone transferred after the first year, like do firms look at that? Where you started? Do they only look at the graduation school? What's kind of most important down the road?
I think it depends where you are down the road. I think that earlier on you may put that you transferred. I think, if you're well into your legal career, they may only kind of even see the school you graduated from. It's more, if you're looking for summer or new jobs that you would have that. I don't think that definitely doesn't reflect poorly. Again, I think it can reflect well on you that you moved up, that you did that well at the first school to transfer. So I think it's a positive for your career, long term. And I just think that if you are moving up enough levels in the school, it is going to make an impact on your choices later on.
Right, because later on that website, they're only going to have basically, so-and-so graduated from this school. It's like, great. Okay. I am hiring this like fancy lawyer. Amazing. Yeah. I mean, I think generally speaking, it's going to give you some more options. Well, that being said, are there any downsides to transferring from a job search point of view?
I don't really know if there's downsides. I have seen situations where they are not transferring enough up kind of the chain in schools that it necessarily makes sense to an employer. So I think there are situations where you sort of need to explain like why you were transferring.
Right.
So maybe sometimes it is a location.
Right. Or more like personal family reasons, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But be prepared for that, because I think that employers expect that if you're transferring from like one tier of schools to another tier of schools. It's not just like, oh, I was moving up 10 rankings. Usually it's a pretty significant difference. So that's a situation where I do think maybe you need to explain it, because it might just kind of raise a question of, why did this happen?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I mean, there are a number of valid reasons to transfer, but I think most people do it, largely to improve their positioning. And there's something you said too, if you want to transfer into like a school in a market that you want to work in or something like that for whatever reason you weren't able or didn't apply to or something the first time. But yeah, generally speaking, if there's not a big jump, people are at least going to be curious about that.
Yeah. So I think I would just be prepared to talk about it. And, there probably was a reason. So
right. Presumably you didn't do this just for fun.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you just need to be able to explain it.
Yeah, I think another thing that comes up, I mean, this isn't directly related to the job search, although it's indirectly related, is the money question. So if you've got a great scholarship at your first school and you have the opportunity to upgrade, but you may be paying full price or close to full price. I mean, I think that is something people, definitely are considering and want to be considering. Because, if you do have significant student debt, that's going to, in some ways, limit your options. Say that you want to do, public interest work or something. That being said, you've also got the possibility that this new school might have an LRAP program that can help you pay back your loans and that kind of thing. So, I think this is a question we get a lot and it's very personal, but it's definitely something to keep on your radar.
Yeah, and I would say if you are in a situation where you just don't think financially it would make sense because, you're getting a full ride at the first school, I think you can also explain that to employers later on. Let's say that you graduated first in your class. I think you could explain you had options to transfer. They offered you the scholarship. But I think people understand that too. It also depends, I think, on what the first school is. Is it just kind of the next year down, or is it way, way down where, their employment rate is very low, their bar passage rate is very low? I think, there are ranges in terms of where people are. So, but I also think you can explain that. I've seen that a lot. I was offered... I didn't pay anything to go to the school, and I feel like I got a good education, and did well. Right. Yeah. I think one of the issues there is you have to continue doing well. So this is also another issue that comes up is oftentimes people worry if they're thinking of transferring, they think that the competition is going to be higher at this new school and maybe they're not going to do as well. But there's also a risk to staying where you are, right? Definitely, because especially if you're, first or second in your class, I think there's a lot of pressure to stay there. And I think some of the lower ranked schools are more competitive than the high. I can think of a few where I've heard, that it's very cutthroat. And part of that is, people are trying to transfer after 1L year. But I also think that I've seen that transfers generally do very well at the school that they transfer to, even if they were coming from, a low-ranked school. If they did really well at the first school, usually they have the right experience, and I've noticed that their work ethic is usually very good. So I haven't really seen that problem in terms of transfers that I've seen. And I think it is a really big worry for people, but I would say, keep doing what you were doing, that you did that well. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think people overestimate certainly the work ethic and probably like the brain power of, the average student at like a top ranked school. Not to say people aren't smart and don't work hard,
But if you were like literally, the very, very top of your class at any law school in the country, you were going to be equally competitive and probably work harder because you're more paranoid than, somebody who's just kind of like middle to bottom of the class at, fancy school.
And the other thing to keep in mind is most of the top schools barely have grades anymore.
Right.
So I think some students don't even realize that when they're transferring because, they're immediately, well, I'm in this percentage. This is my, like, they know exactly where they fit in. And I would say to them, that you won't have any way to measure that at the school you're transferring to. Now, usually there is sort of different schools do it different ways, but like in honors or high honors or middle of the road. But usually there's no way to distinguish, where you are within this sort of bucket of like each third of the class. So I think you'll probably find that easier as well.
No, that's a great point. I mean, we were literally not allowed to calculate a GPA. There was no class rank. I mean, I have literally no idea like where I graduated. It just wasn't something that you were even told. I mean, I'm sure somewhere the school had a list, but they wouldn't tell any. I think they gave a prize to literally the first, like the very top student. And everyone was kind of shocked. Like, oh, I didn't know that person was top of the class. It was just one of those things you had no idea about.
Exactly. And actually, that's probably something to also keep in mind, just like culturally, that if you're used to this sort of competitive or knowing your ranking and you're going into a school that doesn't have that, you kind of have to let that go.
Which I think can be a relief. I mean,
yes, I would think so.
Yeah. I mean, I know somebody who worked with us when I was a clerk and she had transferred to Harvard. And she said one of the reasons she did it was that she didn't want to have to keep being that concerned about her grades for the next 2 years. I mean, of course, there were like tons of other opportunities, which we'll get to in a second. But one of the key reasons was like, my grades will just be less important and then I can focus on doing other things.
Yeah. So I think that's like the best attitude to go into, the transfer.
Yeah. All right, well, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about some other types of sort of career enhancing options that might be available to a transfer student that is not available at their current school. Like what can people expect other than just having way more firms at, on campus interviewing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are other options to sort of enhance, everything. So clerkships are obviously competitive and a lot of times are only, from certain schools or do really well at certain schools. And so I think that's, a good experience for you in terms of, learning and growing and your writing, and also will open more opportunities later on for jobs. So that's one example. Externships or internships. I think there are a lot more options at kind of the top schools, and you will get help in terms of how to find these things. So I think also career services, it varies. It varies in the top schools.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit.
But I think that they, they do want to place you, and now all career services want to place you. But, I think, yes, it does vary, but there are some that may offer.
Regardless of how good or poor you think your new career services office might be, at a minimum, I think you're totally right that they just have options that may not exist other places, so you may have clinics at this new school that you would never have seen before. Like they just have more resources. And things like, federal clerkships from a top school, that whole process is sort of laid out for you. People are not surprised if you ask for recommendations. Like there will be presentations about getting a clerkship. There will probably be presentations about becoming a legal academic, all these things, these doors that suddenly open up. In ways that
I also think alumni,
and
sort of your networking opportunities are huge. There are some schools where the alumni network is so important, and just, who you can be reaching out to, who will talk to you.
Right, exactly. It's always, if somebody comes and they say, hey, I graduated from your law school, like I have a question about this, like I'm probably going to answer that question, I mean, granted, I might answer that question if they just approach me, and typically I do if they're like, I'm a law student and I have a question. But a lot of people will not do that because it's not their actual job.
Yeah. I mean, and if you're looking for a job at a place where if you look at, where the lawyers went to school and it was all these top schools, then you are more likely to, have something in common with them that you can, reach out to them about.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is just there are certain types of jobs that are easier to get if you went to a top school. Like, do you want a top federal clerkship? Top school. Do you want a big law job? Top school. You know, do you want to like be in, you know, some like very well-known public interest organization? Even that actually often requires like a top school, which people are surprised about.
I mean, even the public defender, the DA's office, like even jobs that are not paying that well, right, can be really competitive.
Yeah, and even, you know, so if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, you know, I'm not interested in big law, like maybe I should just stay where I am, totally legitimate choice, but you should also look at these other opportunities and also opportunities for funding, you know, so yeah, if you're thinking about, you know, can you get funding like either for the summer or after school or something like that, like a lot of these top schools either do funding and or they do loan repayment. So in some ways, you know, it still can make sense to you even if you are not interested in these kind of classically like large school, big, you know, fancy jobs.
Definitely. I just think the options are more open. And I don't think that these doors are closed to you if you go to a lower ranked school. And you see people that do really well even at these fancy jobs who went to a lower ranked school. Oh, but it's absolutely just going to be much harder.
Well, the reality is actually once you get the job, once you get a big law job, people at like less prestigious schools are actually more likely to stick around and make partner, which is interesting. So maybe the transfer student would actually be the best of both worlds because they would be, you know, they would have the drive from going to doing really well at a lower ranked school, but then they have the doors opening from these higher ranked transfer schools too.
That's really been my experience. You know, they have usually been the superstars of the class.
Right.
And so I've actually seen where firms are specifically looking for transfer students.
Mm-hmm. That's another I think thing. They love it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a positive. And you see it more and more. I think it used to be less common, so.
Yeah, and then there are also certain schools where they're just like pathways in certain areas, you know, like if you're at like, you know, a lower ranked school in New York, there are like certain schools you transfer to. If you're a lower ranked school in the Bay Area, there's certain schools you typically apply to transfer to. Like, you know, people know that this happens.
Definitely. And actually something to keep in mind just about the decision and situation like that is, so if you know that you are definitely going to work in that market and you're kind of at a school that's more regional, but is okay regionally and people are like recruiting from that school regionally, then I think there are situations where it may make sense to stay and be the top student there because you'll have the exact same opportunities. The issue is if you're not sure if you want to stay there, it may be a lot harder to get into a different market.
Yeah, let's talk about that because I know sometimes people do want to kind of upgrade their school for geographic portability. Yeah, I mean, if you're not really tied to a certain area where your current law school is, I think there is a strong argument for kind of if you can upgrade to a more national school. I mean, how do you think people should think about this?
Yeah, I think you should think about, I mean, it is hard to know, you know, where your life is taking you. And so, you know, you may be sure that you are going to stay and then, you know, your spouse, it turns out, is a professor. And so you're going to have to just live wherever. So there are situations where you just don't know where you're going to end up. So I will say that the sort of more national schools are going to give you, again, the most options, and the most flexibility. But I do think if you are completely sure that you want to be in that market, you know, and they're paying for school and you know you're going to stay and you're at the top of your class, then I can understand making the decision that it's not worth it to transfer. But I think if you're not really sure where your life's going to end up, it does give you more options to be at a national school.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, like you said, you know, it kind of depends where you're starting. I mean, sometimes I talk to people who are at schools that are kind of, you know, in California, unfortunately, maybe on the verge of closing and they're considering staying there. And it's just like, well, I think you need to look at this long term, you know, like,
yes,
what happens if this school gets deaccredited, which is completely possible in this current, you know, environment if they don't get their bar passage rates up. Like there have been schools recently that have been deaccredited in California. You know, that's a tough call, but I think there are definitely some reasons where you might just want to jump ship and get out.
And if you think about it, you know, it's always going to be on your resume. You're always going to have gone to that school. So I think that is something to keep in mind, like long-term career.
Right. Do you want to be explaining, well, actually, when I graduated, they were still accredited. They hadn't shut down yet. You know, it's like, I don't know. I probably would consider that very carefully.
Yeah, if they're Googling your school and it doesn't exist, that could be concerning. So I think, and there are things that happen, that you wouldn't expect. But I think you can tell if a school is on the verge of that or even has had those issues in the past. So I think, it's all things to keep in mind. But I will say that these better national ranked schools are just going to be more solid, going to give you more options and flexibility later on. And the money question is an individual question about what you want for your life and what you can do. So, I wouldn't tell anyone, I think you should go into debt. That's a decision that you have to make. But I do think if you kind of weigh the financials, even if you, let's say, do BigLaw for a few years and pay it back, it might really be worth it. So I would, if money is the issue, I would do the math on those kind of things.
Right. And I think people shouldn't necessarily assume they're not going to get any funding at a school they transfer to. People sometimes think like, oh, I'll definitely have to be paying full price. And that's actually not even the case at a lot of places.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And that's a situation where make sure that you check out all your options and don't just assume.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely where you want to be following up with financial aid and making sure you've got everything in on time, whatever they're asking for, maybe doing, because sometimes people wonder if they should go early decision on transferring and all these things. It's like, well, that often comes down to like, how important is the money to you? Like, do you want to have any negotiating leverage or not? So, this is all complicated stuff, but I think we are kind of coming down on the side of like, it's probably going to help you in your first job search and probably later. Do you think that's right?
I think that's definitely right, with the caveat that, again, it has to be a pretty big step up. And so I'm assuming that that's what we're talking about with most people. So that's the only thing I would say to keep in mind. I know like in California, there's a lot of students at Davis that do really well and have a lot of options, look to transfer. And I don't always think it makes sense to transfer from a Davis to a Berkeley.
Right.
Because I do think you get lots of options being, at Davis. So again, I am saying that, it should be a pretty big bump.
Well, and I think, too, there's certain even top schools where their job numbers are not that amazingly impressive. So you also like actually want to dive into that. There's some where it's just like, oh, do you want a BigLaw job? That's pretty much almost guaranteed. But that's not the case, even at like some very top schools. So I think, just go in with a little bit of, I don't want to say wariness or cynicism, but, examine the options like for real. Don't just listen to like, oh, well, if I upgrade, it's going to all be easy. It's like, well, it might still not be that easy. So you want to make sure you're getting your money's worth if you're going to pay for this.
Yeah, and I would, like you said, look at all the numbers, look at all the details, because I think some people just hear a name and think, oh, I know that school. It seems really prestigious.
Right, but
it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right school to transfer to.
Right. If they talk to you or talk to me, like we can sort of say, well, actually, if you look at this particular school, like, if you're looking at these three options, like this one has much stronger job placement numbers in the market you're looking at versus this other one that maybe doesn't, So that's actually something we can help you with. All right. Any final thoughts on this?
My final thought is that I think that students worry there's some kind of stigma with being a transfer student, and I think it's the opposite. It's a positive.
I agree.
And so if that makes anyone, feel better about it.
Yeah, I agree completely. I don't think anyone, I just can't imagine why anyone would ever look down on you for transferring. Like you did really, really well and you had an opportunity and you took it. Like everybody's going to get behind that.
Definitely. And, you were a hard worker. It actually shows more.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, you can check out careerdicta.com. We will even help you with your transfer applications and help you figure out if this makes sense. So if you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.